Hi, welcome to the Tech F1 show. I'm Matt Summerfield. You may know me from my Twitter account, which is @SummersF1, or you may visit my blog, which is summersf1.co.uk. Obviously, look at the technical side of the sport, and in this episode, I'm concentrating on last week's Barcelona test. Just to give you an indication, really, as to where the teams are at the moment. Obviously, testing is always difficult to read between the lines because you never know what type of fuel loads that the cars are being run on, or whether they're operating with KERS, what engine mode settings they're in, etc. So the teams do have ways and means to hide their performance. Obviously, they can overweight the cars, etc. as well. Things that are used in testing are not necessarily strictly legal either, which is something that has sparked interest over the last couple of tests in regards to the Caterham and Williams blade, which sit within the exhaust channel. Obviously, the FIA have come out over the Barcelona test and actually said that they intend to ban those particular blades coming up for Melbourne. Technically, I would imagine it's difficult for them to do anything but create a new technical directive to cover that particular element of the car, purely because the current rules do strictly permit what Williams and Caterham are actually doing. It's all to do with the truncated cone section coming from the channel of the exhaust itself. So what you have to imagine is when the exhaust exits, it has a visual path in which it should project. However, because of downwash and the Coanda effect, that strictly doesn't happen, and the exhaust actually heads towards the rear tyres, or the slot between the rear tyre and the floor, which is what the teams were trying to do when they were sealing diffusers with exhaust blown diffusers. I think the FIA really do need to make a statement about the situation, purely from the point of view that if they don't, what we've seen with Caterham and Williams is the tip of the iceberg. If they allow this practice to continue, then the teams will exploit it to its maximum advantage, and I do foresee the fact that there is a large potential for what can be done with re-ingesting airflow in that particular region if the FIA don't clamp down on what the Caterham and Williams blade technically entails. We could end up with a situation where teams are almost running what would be classified as an exhaust blown diffuser again through re-ingestion. But perhaps I'll do a separate article on that particular entity, just based on the fact that it's quite difficult to explain. And obviously in the show we want to keep things moving on the whole Barcelona test. Another area that interested quite a lot of people on the Williams was the blown wheel nut at the front of the car. What they've actually done at Williams is perhaps looked at what Red Bull were doing early on in the 2012 season. The Red Bull system was actually banned, or was asked by the FIA for it to be removed from the car because it was outside of the legality back in Montreal. What Red Bull were doing was actually designing the wheel nuts so that they had sections which could blow the airflow from the axle outwards, causing an aerodynamic effect. Now, because it was actually part of the wheel nut, it's classified as a movable device, so the FIA banned that particular version. However, Williams' version there isn't actually part of the wheel nut. The wheel nut itself is actually part of the wheel, as we've seen other teams design over the last few seasons. But what Williams have done is they've left the axle exposed, which allows the airflow from the brake duct to be sent inbound towards the axle and then blown out of the axle. What you may notice is the fact that Williams have gone away from their usual brake duct that they had last season, which was the one that almost rubbed against the wheel, and now they've gone back to a more conventional truncated cone section that heads towards the brakes itself. So obviously that's having a cooling effect on the brakes, but it has an advantage of being able to supply air for the axle to blow out of the centre of the wheel. Now, you might wonder why Williams want to do this. Well, the reason for that is that airflow around the front wheel is quite a messy scenario, and obviously the teams want to manage that as best as possible. So complex front wings, cascades, etc. can only go so far as to manage the airflow. Now we've seen already that Williams have changed their front wing configuration from last season, so obviously the blown axle that they're working with has some effect downstream on the aero, otherwise they would have stuck with their front wing arrangement or configuration from last season. What the blown axle does is it basically helps to manage the airflow that would go over the floor towards the side pod and then onwards to the rear of the car. It's quite a critical area of airflow, so if you get it wrong, i.e. the blowing isn't working as they think it should, then they may choose just not to run it and change front wing configuration. However, it does look like they've got it pretty nailed on. Their times etc. seem pretty good actually. So yeah, I'm impressed with what Williams have done there. We'll see who else tries to adopt that now that it is actually legal, unless the FIA decide that they're going to clamp down on it again. I think that the most physical way of explaining what we're seeing with these blown wheel nuts is the effects that we saw back in sort of 2008, 2009 when the teams actually used physical wheel covers to sort of condition the airflow around the outside of the wheel, and this is a similar scenario. So as I say, it'd be interesting to see if any of the other teams try to adopt what Williams have done there at the front. Whilst we're on the topic of Williams, I thought I'd also discuss a picture that Ted Kravitz from Sky Sports showed on his notebook, I believe in day 3 notebook, which was the Williams nose cone, and it was an internal shot of the nose cone, and what he was showing was the slot that fits underneath the nose of the nose cone. Now obviously with Red Bull and Sauber and now Ferrari having undernose ducts, I think what Ted was trying to infer was that Williams in fact had one of these ducts as well. I don't think that they do. It's a feature that they've had on the car for a while, and it's actually part of the driver cooling capacity, so it comes from the front end of the nose. The air comes in through the front of the nose, and that pushes down this duct towards the bulkhead. So it's not nothing new from Williams, it's just a picture that obviously struck something with Ted because he was looking at the Sauber and Ferrari options as well. So a couple of other things for Williams whilst we're here. Obviously Williams have got the super slim gearbox at the rear of the car, and their engine cover, obviously the engine cover is a mandated size, and so that's why we see that they always have the shark fin attached to the rear of the car. But what we have seen at Barcelona that I haven't seen before is the fact that I call the Williams rear end a crab back because of the way that it almost completely curves underneath the fin itself. And that crab back, they actually took that cover off during day 3, I think it was, of testing. Might have been on day 4 as well, if not both, and took the cover off. Now I don't know whether that was a cooling aspect or whether it's something else that the team were looking into downstream aero wise, but interesting that they would take the cover off, especially as the climate conditions at Barcelona were quite it's quite a cold environment, so I can't see that they would be having too many cooling issues, and so it's strange that they would take the crab back off for that particular reason. However, there is one main thing that I'd like to talk to you about with the FW35 that perhaps I haven't seen covered elsewhere, and it's something that's changed in design from the FW34, and that is the floor region of the FW35. If you have a look at the picture here, the FW35's floor has a curved section that goes from the edge of the floor in towards the Coke bottle. I'm not sure as to why they're actually doing that, and I think it's to do with airflow and getting the airflow down onto the floor, and I'll look into it further, but I thought I'd highlight that fact because I've not seen it mentioned anywhere else. And obviously Lotus's design is very similar with the way that they changed their ramp end in comparison to the Red Bull cross-under tunnel exhaust configuration. So perhaps it's just a way of, when you're using the half shafts exposed as those two teams are, as opposed to how the other teams have all started to enclose their half shafts, perhaps this is just a way of getting the airflow down onto the floor more effectively, and not being encumbered by the half shafts. I think that's pretty much it for Williams. Obviously I'm concentrating on Williams quite a bit there because the FW35 was launched at Barcelona. We saw them using the FW34 back in Jerez. Lotus, now they're a team that have interested me over testing. They're the only team that did a full race simulation that was uninterrupted. Roman Grosjean did that on day 3, and I believe he ran medium, hard, soft in his run, and gave some pretty consistent lap times, to be perfectly honest. The Lotus looks super competitive, just as much as last year, if not even better, and I think there's good things to come from the Lotus this season. Obviously DRD, drag reduction device, is something that I've pushed hard throughout last season because of the Lotus and Mercedes use of it during free practice, and it seems to be something that might be still taken up by the teams for this coming year. It's not a massive advantage, it's never going to be the silver bullet, but it appears that the teams are looking at it in a way that it might give them some additional performance. Lotus haven't run their drag reduction device at Barcelona this week. However, Roman Grosjean actually used the monkey seat from that configuration during his race simulation, which I found interesting because the beam wing configuration for the Lotus rear wing usually has a smaller monkey seat built into it, and that obviously was forsaken in place of the other monkey seat that we see used in the DRD arrangement. Now, whether this was just purely because they wanted the additional downforce, didn't want Roman to take too many chances with the car whilst doing a full race simulation, I don't really know, but as I say, I just thought I'd point it out because it was quite a strange thing for them to try out, I thought. I think Lotus have been testing a couple of rear wings as well anyway. They've been testing the different chord differences between the top flap and the main flap, just to see which configuration works best. They ran 2 different wings last season anyway, throughout the season, and they were testing both of those versions at Barcelona this week. An interesting element that I saw on the Lotus, and was mentioned by Blackout on the F1 Technical Forum as well, was the appendage that they've added inside the roll hoop, and it's a sort of blade type configuration that they've put at the lower end of the roll hoop. Now, the true purpose of that I'm going to have to look into, but obviously again worth mentioning so that you can look at it yourself. The picture's obviously up on the screen at the moment. The blade, it could be used as a way of redirecting the airflow based on the fact that the team have got the ears covered up, the ears that are being used for drag reduction device are bonded to the Lotus E21 chassis, so that's why we see them covered up when they're not in use, and this little blade might be helping to manage the airflow that those covers are actually creating. They might be having a negative effect on the aerodynamics for the roll hoop. The other alternative is that Lotus have obviously found that their roll hoop is of a sufficient size, and they're trying to restrict that size and manage the airflow that goes in there. Obviously airflow is sucked into the airbox rather than being sent directly into the airbox, so managing that airflow is quite critical anyway. However, it might also be part of the larger DRD factor there to enhance the airflow around the airbox and the ears. So we'll see at the next test, I think, what goes on with that particular element on the Lotus, but quite an interesting design. Whilst we're on the topic of DRD, if we just flip over to Mercedes, who tested at the back end of Jerez and again at Barcelona. Didn't so much at Barcelona bring this out, but again DRD, they were testing with a different version of the periscope, which was more keyed towards the Lotus design from 2012, where the periscope itself meets with the underside of the main plane and actually connects to the main plane, and then blows tangentially across the rear wing to stall the central section at a given or set speed. So they tested that again, as I say, at Jerez and Barcelona. Whether we actually see Mercedes use this throughout the season again, I think it's really dependent on who actually uptakes DRD. And the three major teams at the moment who seem to be pushing DRD are Lotus, Mercedes and now Sauber. And if we move over to Sauber, Sauber now have come out with a new rear wing design, which is basically got a much more complex main plane. The main plane sags in the central section so that it can create more downforce. So what I think Sauber are trying to do effectively is create more downforce with the main plane, so getting a net gain from having the larger main plane section. But then also, when they add their DRD device, obviously they have more of an area to stall. So you get a double effect. You'll get more downforce, less drag on the straights when DRD's at its speed threshold. And I also think that will make DRD easier to control. The other thing that we saw courtesy of Sutton Images was the overall configuration of Sauber's DRD, which was the pipe that connects with the ears and leads down to the periscope itself. I think it's a less convoluted system on the Sauber in comparison to, say, the Lotus and Mercedes versions, in as much as that it doesn't really require the extraction methods that the Lotus version does at the trailing end of the engine cover. So the airflow leads, what it would seem, always from the ears on the side of the airbox, which are much smaller on the Sauber as well. The air leads from there down the internal ducting to the periscope and blows the underside of the rear wing to stall it. So what I think they're actually doing is that they're simply allowing that air to always move from the ears down to the underside of the main plane, stalling the rear wing and effectively giving it a soft stall. So as the speed increases, the stall increases. So in effect, what they've gained with the additional section of bodywork or section of main plane, downforce wise, they're actually effectively losing almost instantly via the DRD device. Be interesting to see how that is implemented throughout the season, because it means that DRD can be used all the time, whereas obviously Lotus and Mercedes seem to be having problems with making their devices stall at certain speed thresholds, which is interesting, or an interesting take from Sauber. In the case of Mercedes, it's difficult to see where they're at the moment. They did do some back-to-back testing on their Coanda exhaust versus a new version of the downwash exhaust, just to see where they lay in comparison to last year with the downwash exhaust that they ran. Obviously, because they switched back to it, having used the Coanda exhaust for a couple of races, they decided that they wasn't getting the right effect and actually overwarming the rear tyres with the Coanda exhaust that they tried last season. So obviously just checking really, I think, to see that they are in the right direction with their Coanda exhaust. Ross Brawn's been vocal since the test though, and basically said that the team need to find a second of performance. Now that's a huge chunk of time. I'm not quite sure that they'll be able to find a second. I know that Ross also said that they have the Red Bull style cross-under exhaust channel type of exhaust on the being tested in CFD. So it's plausible that Mercedes might still try to run that type of exhaust configuration. Obviously, we've seen Lotus switch to that this season. It's slightly different to the way that the Red Bull setup works because of various different components at the rear of the car, but obviously it's intrinsically the same sort of setup and works with the same type of construction of airflow, as in that they don't try to mix the air coming around the side pod with the exhaust plume in a way to minimise the effect of the side airflow coming around the side pod affecting the airflow that goes towards the gap between the rear tyre and the floor itself. So it'll be interesting to see if Mercedes actually do come out with that solution. Obviously, testing it in CFD and testing it in the real world is a totally different scenario, because as we saw to start with, Red Bull had problems with making the tunnels work. I'm surprised in that respect that Lotus haven't had the same sort of issues, but obviously they've obviously had it in CFD for a lot longer, and perhaps been wind tunnel testing it for a lot longer as well. As we know from last season, James Allison commented on the fact that they waited for a very long time with their engine cover exhaust to switch to a Coanda style. So interesting that they've switched to the cross under tunnel for this season, and haven't had too many problems. And will also be interesting to see if Mercedes make that switch, having said that they're actually evaluating it in CFD at the moment. Moving on to McLaren. Now, McLaren tested their leading edge slats. I did a piece yesterday on slats and vortex generators, whether it be on top of the side pods or further down on the back of the rear wing of the Ferrari. But McLaren have been using these slats during testing. They took them off during day 3 and 4, but used them in the first few days of the test. They're items that were shown on the 3D render of the MP428, but weren't present on the Jerez version of the car. They're there as a way of helping to keep the flow attached at the rear of the side pod towards the exhaust solution and reducing the boundary layer in that region. If you read the article, it does tend to explain that, and obviously the other iterations that we saw last season with the vortex generators, etc. as well. It'd be interesting to see whether McLaren run those at Melbourne, or even if they continue to test them at Barcelona in the next test. Whilst we're on the topic of McLaren, both the McLaren drivers were vocal about the way in which the Pirelli tyres operate this season, based on what they've seen degradation-wise at Barcelona. And I think a lot of the teams have also been talking about degradation levels and the way that the tyres are affected this season. So it's a topic of conversation amongst the teams, because obviously it's something that will affect the overall performance during a race weekend, whether it be for qualifying or for the race itself. McLaren have obviously decided to run pull rod front suspension this season as well, which is really aimed at trying to counteract the problems that they've had during qualifying over the last few seasons, and specifically Jensen's situation with qualifying. The pull rod suspension obviously allows the tyres to cycle in a different way to the way that a push rod would do that. So I think that decision wasn't only led by aerodynamic advantages, it was also led by the mechanical advantages that might be saw for Jensen. And obviously with Chico being pretty good on tyres as well, you obviously see the benefit for both drivers. So, but both those drivers obviously have spoken out during the Barcelona test about the degradation levels that we've seen at Barcelona. And I think that's just a learning curve for both the drivers on both the suspension geometries, etc., of running with pull rod, and also the change of compound levels from Pirelli themselves. Barcelona is quite a harsh circuit abrasively anyway, and obviously the low temperatures will affect the way in which the tyres degrade because they're not operating within the correct windows. So the teams aren't going to see the full effect of what the tyres will be throughout the season because of the temperature level at Barcelona. What happens is that because of the way that the tyres are constructed and the compounds that are being used, and obviously the temperature that's shown at the circuit at the moment, the tyres tend to shred, so they don't provide perhaps the level of grip that they would do when the temperatures are correct and the tyres are operating within the correct window. A lot of the drivers are saying that the tyres do degrade rather rapidly, and they've seen big fall-offs in performance from over the first couple of laps to obviously the longer stints, but the times don't seem to indicate that. I think it's just a more of a feel thing from the drivers. So, but I think we'll obviously see more of what the tyres have to offer come Melbourne. But obviously Melbourne's less abrasive on the tyres anyway, so it's never going to be a true indicator of what we will see throughout the season. Obviously I just touched on Ferrari when we were talking about slats, and I'd just like to talk again about Ferrari's nose duct. Obviously there's some more pictures come to light of the ducts since we've gone to the Barcelona test compared to when we were at the Jerez test a few weeks ago, so obviously that's more coverage has been available of that duct. Again, it's not an S duct like we're seeing Red Bull and Sauber use this season. This is just a duct that leads underneath the nose, and is there for driver cooling, and I think it's probably onwards towards other cooling as well, but we'll have to wait and see if there's a larger effect in play further down the rest of the test when we head back to Barcelona in a week's time. I think lastly, the last thing I'd like to touch on is Caterham and Marussia, because those two teams at the tail end of the grid are obviously overlooked sometimes. Both cars are really an evolution of the previous cars that they've run. Certainly in the case of Caterham, the CTO3 is really just a new version of the CTO1, and I'm expecting that we might see a few upgrade packages come at the start of the season. I hear that they've got a big upgrade package ready for, or will be in the pipeline for Barcelona, which is quite a long way into the season, but obviously these teams have less capability to be able to produce the type of upgrade packages that we see the leading teams produce. So we'll have to wait and see what Caterham come up with. But Marussia, on the other hand, seem to be a team on the up. I think their alliance with McLaren on a technical partnership is helping them in many respects. And obviously this season they'll also have the Kers on board, which will bring them much closer to Caterham. In fact, I actually think they might make a step beyond Caterham this season, just based on the fact that they'll have the Kers. They were already at a tipping point where they were going to get close to Caterham last season, and obviously it went down to Brazil, who came out with the positioning wise of 10th position. So I think that rivalry will be pretty close this season. And it's interesting, obviously, because both of those teams obviously have less capability in terms of money and infrastructure. So it's interesting to see which team will forsake 2013 to concentrate more on 2014. And at this point, it seems that Marussia are putting more effort into the start of their 2013 campaign. They actually bought a new engine cover to the Barcelona test, which provides a shark fin and looks a lot like the Ferrari style rear end of the engine cover. So again, as I say, Marussia are pushing this season, and I think it'll be interesting to see which of the two teams comes out on top. So where are we at in the 2013 scheme of things? Well, the teams seem to have compacted a little. Some of the midfield teams seem to have been able to produce better cars this season, and it's obviously because we find the rules are very, very close to the ones that we had in 2012, so we've got very converging ideas. For example, everybody on the grid now is running a Coanda style exhaust system, whether it be a semi-Coanda or a full ramp Coanda. So you're obviously going to find that we're at the point of diminishing returns now. I think Williams are a bit closer. Their tyre degradation seems very good. Sauber obviously had a very good level of tyre degradation last season anyway, and I think they're going to have the same this season. Obviously the biggest issue for Sauber this year will be the factor that they've taken on a driver that's in Esteban, or Steve as everybody seems to be calling him. He's new to F1, whereas Hulkenberg is the one with the experience. So it'd be interesting in that team to see the type of dynamic that they have. And unfortunately for Sauber, I don't know if everybody realises this, but Sauber don't actually have a simulator either. So, you know, the only time that the drivers get time technically with a car is when they're in a car, rather than the sort of arrangement that we see at other teams where they have not only their mainstream drivers in the simulator, they also have the drivers, the Brendan Hartleys and etc. of this world driving the simulators all the time during even race weekends to try and give feedback to the engineers so that they can set the cars up how they need to throughout the weekend. So as I say, it'd be interesting to see where Sauber go this season. I think they have a good car technically, and it'll bring them much closer to the front. In terms of who has the best car, the jury's still out. You know, with Red Bull, you never see the car throughout the first part of the pre-season tests that actually going to hit Melbourne. So I expect that Red Bull will bring a few upgrades to the last test at Barcelona, and in the last couple of days I think we'll probably see more of the hand of what Red Bull are going to take to Melbourne. I'm half anticipating a new exhaust solution from Red Bull, to be perfectly honest, but we shall wait and see. McLaren, again, I think it's more about learning from the tyres, and you know they're the team at the front that has the biggest step in terms of car, so that they have the most to understand. And Ferrari are looking good in my opinion. The rear wing end plate slats that I've talked about in the recent article I've done, I think is going to change the way in which the F138 behaves in comparison to the F2012. And I think they're the people to have the biggest gain from the change of qualifying format for DRS, as in it's no longer unlimited. Because both Red Bull and McLaren extracted more performance from their DRS delta to gain advantage in qualifying over the last couple of seasons. So Ferrari are, in my opinion, the team that are going to gain at the front end. And obviously Lotus, the E20 was a strong package, and it appears that the E21 is carrying that over. Obviously with some really good upgrades in terms of the exhaust solution that they've taken on board from Red Bull's style of exhaust, and also it'll be interesting to see whether they carry on with their DRD. So anyway, that's it for this episode of the Tech F1 show. I'd like to thank Sutton Images as usual for their supply of images. It's always great to get the technical shots, etc. And Mark and Emily, etc. do a brilliant job of capturing the images that we need to be able to explain what's going on with the technical side. Obviously I'll do another video post Barcelona, and if you keep your eye out on the site, I'm sure there'll be a few other features that I have in the in-between time.